The Executive Playbook in proud association with Hennessy XO. Each drop is an odyssey.
South Africa, as you know, is one of the most economically unequal countries in the world. It's also not exactly what you would call a friendly environment for small businesses. For a long time, one of the biggest barriers to entry has been the cost and access to digital and card payment services. But professional problem solver and tech fundi Lungisa Matshoba, alongside 3 other business partners, is making it possible for thousands of entrepreneurs to get paid through a mobile-first solution called Yoco. Are entrepreneurs made or are they born?
Gee whiz, that is such an interesting question. If I'm honest, I don't think anyone is born into what they're doing. I think entrepreneurship fundamentally for me is that you're made by your life experiences to be an entrepreneur. However, birth will set you up to some degree. So there is an element of like, if you're coming from specific backgrounds that allow you access to specific academic institutions and stuff, then certain types of entrepreneurship you tend to have an easier road on. But in reality, the entrepreneurs coming out of every walk of life and every part of society. And often when you listen to their stories, it's the journey through life that actually led them to entrepreneurship, not necessarily their birth. Their birth made it possible for them to take action in that entrepreneurship, but the energy behind it came through life experience. So I would say made, if I'm honest.
Made, okay, but you started 13. I mean, your first sort of business venture is at the age of 13. What was it?
So my first business venture was making business cards. It was a completely loss-making business venture. My father bought me the paper, and I used his printer. And as a child, I couldn't work out the economics of it, but I was making money from the venture, right? It's just that when I look back, I was like, that was 100% loss-making, and it was really just my father humoring me.
No, but isn't that great? I mean, it gave you the sense of what was possible, not necessarily real or true, but what was possible.
No, this is correct. This is correct. And I mean, even if I look back at my schooling, so I went to a school in East London called Sterling, and they would have like things like Entrepreneurship Day. And I used to enjoy those kind of things as well. So we've been like at 14 and 15, like we'd sell like buri rolls and make money, etc.
Does that stuff matter? Does it work? Does it trigger something? I look at these things and I wonder if it's just a day of school or is it actually valuable?
I think it depends. I think for me, what it did trigger was just a sense of like enjoying the hustle of getting it all together, the experience of putting together the business. And I think you sort of realize that it's possible. So at the end of the day, I mean, I guess some kids finished the day and had made losses. Other kids finished the day and actually had made money. But, you know, it became part of school culture that you'd plan this and you'd try to do something. So we actually did it like once really, but I do think it does matter. It sets a sense of possibility. So I think for me at least it mattered.
And there's just the fundamental principles of you buy something, you theoretically add value to it and you sell it at a profit. And then at the end of the day, you see whether or not it worked. And that should teach you some fundamental principles, including the principle of collecting money.
Correct. And also just the idea that you can add value to something. I think that was the thing. Like, I mean, you did some work in the middle, as you say, and you've added value. And that is something really special to learn, that like, just because they sell the boerewors at Pick n Pay doesn't mean that that's the price you need to sell something that you've added value to on. And I think that is a fundamental lesson that is important.
So you start building and you start doing things. You then start a business, very successful business, in what we used to call voice over IP. Now we just do WhatsApp calls. Voice over IP was a trendy thing because telecommunications weren't working well enough and they were very, very expensive. And so lots of people got into this idea of maybe you can make telephone calls over this wonderful thing called the internet, which is connected all over the world. Anyway, you build that business called Yisha.
Yoco,
and sold it, and that again being the purpose of starting a business, especially when you're younger, build it, grow it, sell it, and you did.
Yeah, I mean that was like a fantastic experience. Like, I mean, there learned so many things. We had to raise capital, we had to build stuff. I think also coming out of university, we're taught a lot how to start projects. And I guess you start projects and people mark you almost at the halfway point, and that's great. And then you start this thing for the first time, and you know what? Nobody cares about the halfway point. It's all about finishing, getting it done, getting it to customers, getting it to scale, etc. So many lessons like learned along the way there. probably one of the most exciting learning experiences in my life. At the same time, to be honest, like walking out of varsity and starting a business, that is a school of hard knocks.
Because I know a young economist, well, he's getting older now, but his name is Kanti Pai. You may have heard of Kanti Pai. And I was chatting to him the one day, and he just said, you know what? There's so few jobs in South Africa, and we've got this real jobs crisis, and government keeps saying to young people, go and start your own business. And he says, telling young people to start their own business in South Africa is a cruel hoax. And I mean, I get goosebumps just reliving that moment, because it struck me as being so true. Lots of people start, most people fail, very few people manage to survive the school of hard knocks because it is flippin' difficult.
Yeah, look, it is hard. I think at the same time, though, I think maybe one of the issues is just the acceptance of failure. The reality is failure is going to happen if you start businesses. The trick is realizing that it will happen and realizing that, cool, from day one, you should know that this will not be the last business you start. You will do it again. Which means when the failure comes, you actually let it happen faster, because you're like, cool, I've now validated that that is not the right business for me to start. What's the next one? So I think more cruel is this idea that we put so much pressure, and it often forces businesses to work through a part of the business that they should not, because now they've validated it doesn't work, but they keep going. And that's when the hardships really, really come, when you're flogging an idea that is not going to work. So to some degree, yes, telling people to start businesses, but I don't really think there's anything else we can tell people. You know, it's not like there are these jobs out there in the economy. We need people to start businesses. What we need to do is normalize the idea that not every business you start will fail, and it's okay. And there's a lot of things we could do to actually do that. But I think that's the trick to it, is let's normalize failure and acceptance of it, and restarting, and almost telling people that I will actually prefer to invest in someone on their second try because they've learned so much. Not, oh no, you failed, so I won't invest in you, prove that you fail. It's the opposite. You prove that you've learned some stuff and are willing to try again.
I was listening to a podcast between Larry King talking to Simon Sinek. Now, Simon is a global speaker. He's a TED speaker. He's built a great business and a great brand of his own. He's been brilliant. And he was just saying the American culture of failure and tolerating failure and encouraging that failure is what is making the United States such an innovative and powerful force in the world of business, particularly in tech businesses, whereas he used the example of Europe, incredibly critical of failure. In South Africa, we're incredibly critical of failure.
Yeah, and it's interesting that you mentioned Europe. Like there's so many startups that have kind of come out of the little nation of Sweden in Europe, right? And I was chatting to someone recently, they made me aware that one of the things that's interesting about Sweden is they have an amazing safety net for catching people when they fail. So he's correct. Like, I think the idea that if you can be caught from failure, like it is in the US, I mean, the US, I won't say caught, but the consequences are less real, or caught from failure like in Sweden, then you will be encouraged to start business and actually try to do something with that. So I think there is something. The stigma of failure in South Africa is real, and people do feel it.
There's the story that you and Katlego Mapai were friends as kids, and Katlego is one of your co-founders, chief executive of the business, and you were friends as kids, and you're standing in a queue at UCT, and in those days you had a magnificent mane of dreadlocks, and you start chatting, and next thing Katlego says, but I know you. Yeah. How important is that connection when you are looking to start a business? Because then you go your separate ways, you all go into the telecoms industry, as I record it, and later on you all come together and start Yoco. How important is that sense of network, that sense of belonging, that sense of trust, that sense of sameness, perhaps, that gives you a sense of comfort to go into business with someone?
Yeah, it's interesting. Like, I'm one of 4 co-founders in Yoco, and we've all been in the business together since the start. And the more I speak to people, the more I realize the rarity of that. Often businesses have had changes in their founding team, somebody who's moved on, etc. And I think one of the key things that's allowed us to work that way together is connection. Like, I genuinely feel connected to each of my co-founders. I understand why they do this, what's behind the mission we're on for them. And I guess it's the same with Katlego. And I think what's interesting is he actually brought a lot of us together as a founding team. So he actually built really deep connections with people. And he was able to sort of realize that we're a team that could work together for quite an extended period. And I think it comes down to that common fabric. I don't think there's a sameness to it per se. We're not all the same, but we have common values between us and common things that we find important. And this allows us to synchronize very quickly on key decisions for the company. And I think that is extremely important.
How do you deal with conflict? Because there must be conflict. You can have the same values, you can have the same broad idea as to what you want to build, but you may have very, very different GPS systems or map systems as to how you want to get there.
Yeah, and I think it's so interesting. Like, I think there's people you can have conflict with, but then it leads to a situation where you don't enjoy engaging with them. And there's people that you can engage with in the conflict, and you actually almost go through the conflict together, and at the end of it, you're laughing, to be honest. And I think that's really important. Like, we take jibes at each other. We don't take each other 100% seriously when it comes to stuff. This allows us to actually get into stuff and really debate stuff. So the trick is that we debate. Like, we get into it, we talk about stuff, we don't just leave it. And it's because we know that, like, getting into that and getting into the hard stuff, because it matters to all of you, is the best way to get to a good answer. The problem is when people can't get into stuff because that conflict would lead to the relationships tearing apart. Then they avoid the things that would actually lead to success in the business, because those are often the toughest things. The toughest debates are often the most important ones for the success of any business. And I think you've got to have that relationship and that rapport to do it.
Relationship, rapport, and we can do 3 R's. Respect.
Yeah.
Because if you fundamentally respect those individuals, if you would go to war for those individuals and they would go to war for you, then there's trust. And that mutual respect. Without respect, you can't ultimately trust.
Yeah. And I think the respect also just comes from each of you having, like, shown up at different times, where if that person hadn't shown up, the business would not be what the business is today. And I think there's clear moments throughout where, you know, each person has actually shown up and steered the business and towards the successful direction. So you can always trust that someone's got your back. They're going to raise it in this direction or that direction. And I think that's equally important. And that's what creates the respect at the end of the day. It's
like watching the Springboks, running for a try line, and you're about to get tackled and you pass because you know your teammate's right there.
Correct.
And it's knowing that backup is right there. The conversation, I once had a discussion with Laurie Dippenaar about him, GT Ferreira, and Paul Harris, and how they stuck together for 40 years. You've still got a way to go. But created a multi-billion-dollar, globally relevant, highly competitive, extraordinary financial services business. How did you stick together? And Laurie Dippenaar just used one word, and he went, facts. And I went, and his argument was, yes, you'll have different views, different opinions, but you have shared values, same goal, and whoever brings the best facts to the table wins the argument, and then you commit to that because you know you're dealing with smart people that you enjoy working with and respect. And that's, again, a very similar principle to what you guys are doing.
I also like the mention of the word commit. There's something we like to do where, you know, you can disagree with something and then commit to it nonetheless. And this idea that, like, let's say, you know, we're having, you know, a debate around something and it doesn't go my way. And I'm like, gee, I wasn't happy that it went this way. The trick is to commit behind the fact that it went that way and make sure that way succeeds. I think too often in teams, if it doesn't go your way, someone steps back and goes, yeah, and then waits for it to fail so they can say, you see, I told you. Yeah. I never want to say that. I never want to be in a position where there's a decision that was made and, you know, I didn't agree with it and then it failed. I need to make it succeed so that I can be wrong.
The most important thing in any business is getting paid. For so many people, the complexity of getting onto the national payment system, you and I, well, you wouldn't take it, I might take it for granted, that if I go anywhere in the world, I can take out a piece of plastic with a magnetic strip or a chip in it, I can tap it or swipe it, and money comes out of my account and I get a product or a service no matter where I am. It's an absolute miracle of finance and technology and opportunity, but the vast majority of people, until fairly recently, haven't had access to that global payment system. And I think that was the trigger for the starting of Yoco.
Yeah, and I think what's even, I guess, more bizarre in the South African context when we looked at it in the early days was, you know, in many other ecosystems, you don't have access to it from both sides. So the consumers have no way to pay digitally and businesses have no way to accept digitally. South Africa was a bit of an oddity we looked at the numbers, and 70% of adults in the country had a card, and this was like back in 2014 already. Yet less than 10% of businesses could accept them. So you realize you had a bit of a lopsided system where, from a major like retailer perspective, major companies, they were accepting cards and people were using their cards to play in those contexts. But nobody had taken care of providing smaller businesses with the exact same access. So often you had a really lopsided system where, there was digital ways to pay, but they just weren't distributed in the market.
What you've also learned by putting these Yoco machines, and I think at last check there were 200,000, maybe it's 220, maybe it's 230. I feel like an auctioneer going up in numbers until I see a nod.
It's interesting. We counted more in terms of customers. So we have 150,000 customers. Some have one machine, some have two, some have more, etc.
So take me through the fundamental change that happens when people move from a cash economy into a digital economy, because it causes a huge shift in the economics of running their small enterprises.
The first shift is that you're in a position where you have tracked financial data that you can use to grow your business. So ultimately, cash, you're writing stuff in a book, but there's no real way to validate it. So if you need to then go and if you want to get stock loans or grow your business in some way, you're not able to do that. Now suddenly you have these card receipts that you can prove that revenue is running through your business. This moves you from being in the sort of hyper informalized to actually being able to show value to grow your business, etc. So that's one of the areas. The other one, which we picked up really early in the early days, was we would always see businesses growing when they started to accept card, and often businesses who didn't expect it. Businesses and markets who been running with cash for a long time and assumed that they were getting complete access to the business at hand. It turns out that their customers were reserving what is in their pocket, because at the end of the day, if you've got 100 Rand in your pocket, you need to divide that by all the things that you might need to spend 100 Rand on. If you come across something that costs 80 that you want, you don't know what else is around the corner. So you're like, hey, but this 100 Rand, I might need it for something, so I'm going to hold on to it. The thing about the card is you have access to what you need to. So at that point, you can go, actually, I want this thing, let me purchase it. They were missing out on all those sales, and they weren't even aware that this was happening. We would see businesses reaching out to us, telling us that they've grown by 40 to 60%. This was something that was really, really exciting and wonderful to see. And it wasn't always the case that they had customers who would walk, do you accept card? No, and walk away. That's sort of the obvious interactions. And those businesses would grow as well. But they were customers who just would not see a Visa or MasterCard sign and just walk right past. And when they saw it, they would stop and engage with the customer. So I think that was one of the early changes that we saw as well, was getting access to more share of wallet from the same people who were walking past your store in the past.
And so many of the people who are in these micro enterprises for themselves feel like the underdogs. They feel like they don't belong. They don't feel like they're part of a system. The system feels like it works against them. And you play on that in a new advertising campaign. It's all virtual, so we're going to put it on television so that people can get who not on the internet. It's a wonderful invention. Everyone should get it. But it's just this, it gives you a real feel of the grit of running a small enterprise, the frustration and the rage of running an enterprise, and what you're seeking to achieve. Have a look at this.
Everyone loves an underdog story until you're the underdog. The underdog chases heart when the head says no. The underdog does not wait for opportunity to knock, stubborn and resolute, in the belief that it will be okay. Because the underdog is not supposed to win, and yet, here you are.
But that gives you a real sense of it, that pain and anguish that Auntie talks about in terms of running the small business and what you're seeking to achieve. I chatted to Alan Winde once, and Alan Winde is the Premier of the Western Cape, of course, and he's a big fan of what Yoco does, and he'd just been to visit your offices somewhere down there in Short Market Street, and he said, these guys are amazing. And they're just empowering businesses. And he gets quite excited because he was a small business guy in Plet when he started out. And just the ability to have the data that you can go to somebody to lend you money and say, here are my sales over the weekend. You give me 20 grand on a Friday, and I can pay it back to you with interest on Monday. And here's the proof that I do it each and every weekend. I want to scale up. And that's a huge opportunity.
Correct. And I think what we've always tried to anchor as well is realizing that we always are more than payments. From day one, when we launched our products, it is payments with additional services that surround it. One of the additional services is allowing you to add items to your app, so that when you sell like a coffee, you press a button and it logs that you've sold a coffee, etc. This means beyond having like a list of like transactions that you did, you're also able to see what those transactions were, and then analyze that data to understand what you can do to improve your business. If something is selling well and you're constantly running out of stock at like the half-day mark, you can see this, you can understand this. So the idea of starting to say, look, now that you have a digital payment system in your business, what you actually have is a piece of software dedicated to your business. How do we use that to make your business better over time?
We previously had Aisha Pandor, who you know, with Sweep South and Sweep South Connect, and she's expanding into Kenya and Nigeria, looking at Egypt and no doubt at many other African economies. And the thing that has struck her about going into these markets is the complexity of payment systems, something that we take for granted, because no matter where we go, we can probably use a card to transact. Something as simple as that, or an app, or a digital transaction. Payment systems are an extraordinary African opportunity.
They are. I mean, there is so much opportunity, and I think, what probably as well, like, if you look at Sweep South, as a business, they're looking for how do they, one, obviously access payments, but two, have the simplicity to, across multiple markets, not have to like run 1,000 different accounts to actually be able to accept these payments. So, their core business isn't payments. And I think that's really the thing, is that, many companies, as they start to expand, they end up starting to feel like they're a payments company because they have to know all these details of payments. And this is something that's really important. Like, to some degree, like if you're a business owner, payments is the thing I want you to know very little about, because that's making your life complicated. You shouldn't even be thinking about recon. You should be thinking about selling to your customers and growing. And I can imagine the multiple levels of complexity that a business trying to expand across the continent has today. And I think that is a serious challenge, and it's something that companies like us look at and go, this is the other opportunity that we need to look at, is that on the one hand, we need to really start to think of how can it be so hard for companies to do what they do at a multinational perspective. So I think it's too complicated today, but it doesn't have to be in the future. And if you look at what's happening in South Africa now in payments, is by having companies that play on the side of creating the merchant ecosystem, it makes it easier for everyone to accept. This can start to expand to a wider base of customers.
How do you guys define success? Because you are successful, you are growing. You recently raised 1.2 billion rand. It's a lot of money from investors to expand and to grow further. I mean, that suggests success. Do you see yourselves as successful?
So it's a funny thing. Like for me, like capital raises, definitely don't see them as success. I see them as the tools that can lead you towards success. So I think we've raised a round of capital that allows us to pursue the mission of the company and to really touch more SMEs and to expand our base of customers and our base of services and the markets that we serve. I think ultimate success is playing a role in really kind of starting to transform the ecosystem in South Africa and in the rest of the continent, because SMEs have such a pivotal part to play in that. If you think about an SME versus like a large corporation, the owner of the SME actually typically operates around where his business is. He spends money in the local region, which means we actually end up with a better distribution of wealth. And this is sort of the critical role that SMEs have to play, is that small businesses lead to wealth distribution and can actually help us lower the inequality in our society. For me, when we start to see that spread to a larger scale, that becomes success. But to do that, we need to give small businesses the tools to make this easy. There's enough hard stuff in starting a business that you don't need payments, tracking, business tools, finance, all these things should not be the hard part. Serving your customer, that is the hard part. But if you crack that and the rest of it makes you fail, that's a real problem.
And too many people are failing because they're spending far too much time on focusing on the boring stuff, which is the admin. Not that what you do is boring, it's very exciting. But the really mundane stuff that they didn't sign up for. They signed up to create the thing that they're selling to the customer. And that interaction is what is so powerful. And then they're spending the other 8 hours of the day, catching up and trying to figure out what on earth happened in their books. And it's boring.
Exactly, right? Exactly. And, how are you going to succeed in your business when you're being taken away from it by all these other concerns?
Lungi, thank you so much for chatting. It's a really wonderful insight into the world of Yoco. Lungisa Matshoba, who is one of the co-founders of Yoco, who used to have dreadlocks. The Executive Playbook in association with Hennessy XO, celebrating personal and business success.